Well, now we're going to talk about another subject which is very weighty and which has unfortunately led to the demise of some in ministry. And so it's extremely important and one that you no doubt have heard about before and have already dealt with personally in your own life. And that is the issue of finances. So I begin with a caution here. This is one of the most challenging aspects of missionary work and has all too often been the cause of strife and division on the mission field. Now, I've heard it said that one of the main causes of marital stress and even divorce has been problems with money. If you stop and think about it, just about everything you do in life involves money in some way. All right, very few things come for free. The air you breathe is free, but even then, there are people that work hard to make sure the air is clean, and there is money spent to make sure that that's the case. I mean, it's very, very hard to imagine any activity in life that doesn't somehow bring money into the picture. And money is a universal. Anywhere you go in the world, you're going to deal with some form of currency. You're going to be exchanging money but you are going to be spending money in one form or another. So I want to talk to you about this because it's very important you get a handle on this before it gets a throat hold on you. And that can happen anywhere in life, whether you're in ministry or not. So this discussion has implications far beyond the borders of vocational ministry. Now, when it does come to ministry, who decides who gets to spend the money or how the money is going to be spent? When you're dealing with missionaries, you're dealing with people who are commissioned by their local churches and who are normally involved with a mission agency and who work with colleagues on the field. And so there potentially is quite a variety of input when it comes to how you're going to spend the money that you've raised. Now, right off the bat, you might say, wait a minute. I went around from church to church and raised that money myself. I gave 2 or 3 or 4 years of my life to slaving away to raise that money. So nobody's going to tell me how to spend my money. Well, I think you can see the flaw in that attitude. The reason that you went around and raised money was not so that you could be the sole decider about it, but so that the money would be there for God to use how he chooses to use it and through the people that are involved in the decision-making process. So if there is no mission agency involved, then the sending church and the missionary work together to arrive at a reasonable amount. All right. Now, a lot of times the sending church really won't have any idea how much you're going to need. When we went to Brazil, my sending church had no idea of what would be a legitimate amount of money to raise. They don't understand the standard of living in Brazil, and the kinds of things I was going to be buying and spending money on, and so usually the sending church will yield to the mission agency because they have experience and there are people on most of the fields where missionaries are sent who could give them an idea. But when there is no agency involved, the missionary and the sending church have to work together. And in that kind of a scenario, I would say that probably the wisest thing to do is to get in contact with missionaries on that field, or if you're opening a brand new field, missionaries in a country that would be similar to that, to try to get some idea as to how much you're going to be spending in order to carry on your ministry and life there in that country. The agency, as I said, normally takes the lead when an agency is involved because they have a lot more experience with that. And so it's important that you yield to that. My wife and I, when we went to Brazil, sat down with people at the mission agency home office, and they presented to us a plan for what we would need. And of course, I had no experience living in Brazil. My wife did have experience, but she grew up, under the leadership of her parents, and she didn't have to deal with all of those decisions that her mom and dad dealt with when they were on the field. And so we pretty much just said yes to whatever the agency told us, believing that they were giving us a reasonable amount. And as it turned out, they were right on target. I mean, what they said we needed based on other missionaries was precisely what was adequate for our ministry. When possible, the amount is based on the income of missionary colleagues already in the field. Now, let me just say something about this. Colleagues are not all the same when it comes to how to live. There are missionaries working together in the same location who have different opinions about how nice of a house they should have, or what kind of a car they should be driving, or how much to spend on food or clothing or vacation or the things like that. And so just because you're dealing with colleagues living in the same country doesn't mean that everybody's going to agree on that. Some missionaries feel very strongly about living on a level much closer to the reality of the people, the nationals there in that country, while others say, they understand we're foreigners and they don't expect us to live on the same standard that they do. So colleagues are an important consideration, but just keep that in mind. Not every colleague is going to agree on every detail. A new missionary may be asked to raise a little more, since veteran missionaries often have learned to live on less over the years. It's like anything else. When you've had experience living in a certain location, you know what you can cut out and what needs to be emphasized, what you can live without, and that sort of thing. But when you're going there for the first time, you have no idea what it's like to live in that culture. You're generally going to need a little bit more, because the fact is you're going to spend more money because of the uncertainties and the inexperience on your part. So just keep that in mind. If a missionary who's been there for 20 or 30 years says, you don't need all of that, we get along with this and this, don't feel guilty if you're living on a little bit more, because that missionary has had several years to learn how to tweak his lifestyle and understand the culture and the market there to get along with less. That doesn't make him better. It just means that he has had more experience and more time to deal with that. Now, what about dividing up money? Is all money the same? Is it all your money? Well, no, that's not the case, because the fact that you're living in a culture different than your own, in a political system that's different than your own, that has tax laws that are different than your country's, is going to require some understanding of the way that money can be used or not used in certain situations. And so normally mission agencies will divide up the funds that a missionary uses into two general categories. The first is personal funds, and these are taxable. In other words, money that I raise to buy the food that we eat and the clothing for our children, okay, and vacations that we take and other personal things are funds that are taxable here in the U.S. The dollars that are spent on those types of things are taxable. And this can get really complicated. Different fields have different ways of handling that. Missionaries often have to write down what they use for personal funds, personal things, and what they use for ministry things. And so records have to be kept. Some fields that are a little bit more experienced in that have come up with systems that facilitate that and make it a whole lot easier for the missionary to keep track. What are some examples of personal funds? Well, insurance, health insurance and your life insurance, those are personal. Housing and utilities, food and clothing. If you send your children to a private school in the country or to an MK school where they have to pay, those are personal funds. Transportation, family vacations, and things like that. The second category is work funds, and these would be non-taxable funds because of the tax laws in our country. And these include building materials. If you're building a church or a school or a camp in another country, those funds are not taxable. audiovisual equipment, aid given to nationals, printed materials, documentation like your passport and visa needs, and things like that. Those are work funds. And again, a mission agency can help you to understand what's personal and what's work. And sometimes even that is a little bit debatable. For instance, if you hire a house worker, or used to be called a maid, to work for you in your home, and the reason you hire her is because it frees you to do ministry work, then to some extent you could consider paying her a ministry or work expense. And again, that's something that requires a whole lot more discussion, and you'll get into if you end up serving on the mission field. Pastors here in the States have to deal with that sort of thing as well. To what extent, are things in their home or their lives can be, to what extent can they be considered work funds because of their relationship to ministry? So, interesting discussion. Well, how do you raise the money? Well, again, there's more than one way to do that. First of all, you share your burden with churches and individuals. Raising money is a reality for most missionaries. Now, there are some that talk about tent making, where you start a business in another country on your own, and you completely support yourself. We'll talk about that in a little bit, but for the most part, missionaries don't do that, or at least not completely. They raise money through churches and individuals. Is it biblical to raise money through individuals? Is it biblical for an individual to support you for $100 or $200 a month or whatever? The answer is yes, as long as your commissioning church is ultimately overseeing your ministry and you are accountable to that sending church. Okay? To say that every dollar that's raised has to be raised through a church is simply not a biblical demand. It's a nice thing. There's nothing wrong with it. And most of our money came from supporting churches, even though there were individuals who supported us as well. But there's nothing unscriptural about individuals helping with support. Look, prepare yourself for a 2 or 3 period of time for this. Raising funds today tends to take a little longer than it did a generation ago for a number of reasons, but 2 or 3 years of full-time fundraising is necessary. Now, remember, we talked a while back about denominational agencies and independent agencies, and we dealt with this issue. And we also said that, 2 or 3 years sounds like a long time, but if you are able to raise all of your funds to basically support you for the rest of your ministry career, then 2 or 3 years is not in any way an inordinate amount of time to do that. And it's also, as we mentioned before, a great time of learning and growing and maturing. You remember that raising support is really about raising partners. You're not just raising funds. Those people who support you are servants of God with whom you should have a relationship, and their churches will pray for you, and you communicate with them by sending periodic reports of your ministry work. So you're not just raising money, you are developing relationships with God's people that many times will become very, very strategic in encouraging you, and sometimes they'll even come down and visit you or over wherever you are, come to visit you in your place of ministry. So it's far beyond the dollar sign. And also keep in mind that raising money is not begging for money. In Philippians chapter 4, when Paul is thanking the Philippians for helping him time and again in his ministry, he says in verse 17, "It's not that I desire a gift, but I desire fruit that may abound to your account." In other words, what he was saying is, I'm not just a guy standing here, waiting for handouts. I'm not begging you for money. You helped me in a way that extends your ministry, and the fruit that God allows me to produce is your fruit as well, because I'm an extension of your ministry. And so you get to rejoice when God does things through me on the field. And that's the way that we need to look at it when we're thinking about fundraising. You're going out as an extension of that church's ministry, and when God blesses you, He is blessing that church at the same time. They're sharing in the blessings and fruit of ministry. And if you can keep it in that perspective, it'll really help you to avoid this syndrome of just begging for money and asking for handouts like some people conceive of missions work to be. That's not the way it is, and I hope that you'll never see it that way.